That's hard to do, to kind of stand up and admit to a group of people that you're an alcoholic. My grandfather was an alcoholic, died in New York City homeless. To stand up and to say to people that you're that weak, that you're that given over to struggle, it's hard to stand before a group and say how frail you are. And so when Tony asked me if he could do this, I said yes. And listening to him this morning, it reminded me of this fellow I knew in New Jersey who did the same thing. And he stood up in front of the congregation, and his name wasn't really Jacob, but he said, "You can call me Jacob." And he said, "I am like Jacob from the Old Testament," because Jacob's life was a struggle. It was a struggle with others. It was a struggle with God. And this fellow said, "I have struggled my whole life with my family. I've struggled with my job. I've struggled with my wife and my kids." He said, "Life has been a struggle, and so I drank." And he says, "I drank, and I drank, and I drank," and he lost it all. He lost everything. He had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, and he lost that as well. Anyways, he said, "You call me Jacob," because Jacob was a man who struggled. It was a life around struggle. He struggled with his family. You know the story when he was younger? He stole his brother's birthright. Remember that story from Sunday school? He, much to his mother's encouragement, he dressed up like his brother, his older brother. Remember, he dressed like his older brother. He put fur on his hand and on his arms because his brother had hairy arms. And he went to his father, and his father said, "Who's there?" And his father, because his father was struggling with blindness, and he says, "Who's there?" And he says, "Well, it's me, Esau." And it wasn't, it was Jacob. He lied. He outright lied. And his father ends up blessing him and giving him the blessing that he was supposed to go to Esau. And so when Esau found out, he threatened to kill his brother, and Jacob fled. Jacob fled to live with his uncle Laban, remember? And he worked 7 years to marry one sister, but then his uncle kind of deceived him, and so he married the one sister, the older sister, and then he had to work another 7 years, and finally he gets tired of his uncle and all his stuff and steals from his uncle, and then he flees. And here's where we catch the story where Jacob is on the road and he is about to meet his older brother. His older brother has caught up with him. And he's nervous and he's upset that his older brother's going to kill him. And so he concocts this great plan. He says, "Well, I'm going to basically bribe my older brother. I'm going to send him all these wonderful gifts. And then I'm going to send him, more stuff. And hopefully by the time he gets to me, he won't kill me." And in the story today, he even sends off his 2 wives and his servants and his kids and his whole family before him, so that he's the very last. Kind of some nerve, huh? I mean, the man was willing to sacrifice everything and everybody to save his life because he was worried about Esau trying to kill him. The end of the story is that after sending all this stuff, he does meet Esau, and Esau runs and embraces him and loves him. That night, though, the night before he meets Esau, he wrestles with a divine messenger. Some people say that it's an angel. In fact, the prophet Hosea says it's an angel. Other people say it's God. Even Jacob said, I've seen God face to face and survived. And other people, someone said to me this past week that it's Christ, that he's wrestling with Christ. Anyways, let me read you the story out of Genesis chapter 32. That night, Jacob got up, took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overcome him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." And Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. I'm sure there are some of you that are like Tony, struggling with issues in your life. This past week, I got a phone call from my daughter, Elizabeth, and she's struggling about what internship she should take. She's at the university working on her master's degree, and she's like, "Dad, if I go this direction, then that's what I'm going to have to put on my resume, and I'm not sure if that would look the best, or if I should put this on my resume, and if I do this, or this third option." And then she says, "Dad, plus I have very good friends that are all looking at the same internships, and I would feel really bad if I took an internship from them." She called me again later in the week, and she said, "Dad, will you call Ian," her fiance? Ian's really struggling with what to do after undergraduate school, and he wants to go on and get a master's degree, but he's really struggling. He just feels so lost. And she said, "He could really use your encouragement." It was a great conversation. Ian lost his father when he was 16. He passed away and when he was young, and so I said to Ian, I held back the tears, and I said to Ian, I said, "I know you lost your dad, and I can't replace him, but I'd love to help. I want you to be able to talk. I want you to be able to talk over these issues and scream and yell if you have to. Let me have it. I've been in ministry for 25 years. There's nothing you can tell me that will surprise me." And he appreciated the encouragement, and before he hung up the phone, he says, "I love you, Dad." Zach has been struggling with his job at Home Depot because the kids take so many hours at ASU, and he couldn't do all that work, plus hold a job, plus volunteer at church, and the list goes on. And he was down to 3 hours of sleep a night, and finally said, "Enough with the job." I'm sure you have your struggles too, and I'm sure you have those moments where you wrestle with God. As I look at this story, I see that there are three truths here. When we wrestle with God, when we wrestle with life, when we wrestle with people we love. The first truth is this: when we wrestle with God, we merge marked by God. We cannot wrestle with God and then walk away unscarred. It says this: when the man saw that he couldn't overpower Jacob, he touched his socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched out of socket as he wrestled with the man. And then at the very end, it says that Jacob walked away with a limp. God touches us in many amazing ways, does he not? God touches us in some beautiful ways. He touches us when he helps us through unemployment, or a failed marriage, or a financial disaster. There are some beautiful ways that God touches our life. He touches us, and he turns our hearts towards him. One of my favorite examples of God's touch on our life occurred when the leper approached Jesus, begging him for healing. You know, at that time, when lepers walked out in public, people had to yell. It was the law that they had to yell, "There goes an unclean person," so that everybody would stay away. No one would accidentally touch him. No one would come near him. Can you imagine going to Fry's grocery store? And as you walked into the grocery store, people would be able to look at your problems and go, "Unclean, unclean, that person is unclean," because they know something about you. Well, you can imagine a leper never having someone touch them, having no one to embrace them, no one to hug them, because it was against the law. They were unclean. They were devoid of all physical contact. But Jesus, disregarding the law of humankind, in response to the leper's pleading, reaches out and touches this man. And he was healed. Yes, it's true. God touches us in some very wonderful, beautiful ways. And I think we witness that on Sunday morning when we hear the prayer celebrations and the concerns. But God touches our lives in other ways. Does he not? Did he not touch Jacob's way in an interesting way? You see, he touched Jacob's life, but he scarred him for life. Jacob walked with a limp for the rest of his life because he had been in the presence of God. I think, though, that's even beautiful in its own way, is it not? I mean, I read a story this past week of a man who had everything. He had everything. He was a young man. He was a high-energy guy. He had a great job. He was doing financially well. He had a promotion at work. His relationship with his wife was going well. His whole family was doing well. His life at his church seemed to be going well. He was teaching the leadership class, the men's Bible study. He was teaching a small group in his home. He was an elder in his church. Everything seemed to be going so smoothly. However, when he and his wife were visiting Portland, he came out of a mall, and all of a sudden, the cold air hit his lungs, and all of a sudden, he just could not breathe. And he looked around, and everybody was doing fine, but he just could not catch his breath. They rushed him to the hospital, and the next thing they know is he's having double bypass surgery. Young man, true story. And he says this thing changed his life. He couldn't be the go, go, go fellow anymore that woke up at sunrise and went to bed late at night and just filled the day with all kinds of activity and all kinds of work. He just couldn't do that anymore. It slowed him down. And when it slowed him down, it made him pay attention better. He paid attention to his wife and his kids, and he paid attention to those in need. He said, "It changed my life." And he realized that he just had to slow down a little bit. He said, God used this thing to change his life. And then he says, every once in a while, he still loses his breath. Every once in a while, he still has a pain. In fact, he said, not too long ago, he said, I was just in the store with Barnes & Noble standing in line, and all of a sudden I got this pain. And I got nauseous, he said. They went to the doctors to have him checked out. The doctor said, you're fine, but occasionally you'll have this. He said it was a scar for life because he had been with God. God had changed his life, and he said God uses that to remind him. When we wrestle with God, we do not emerge unscarred. There's always a price to be paid when we struggle with God. God wrestled with Jacob that night. And I think Jacob didn't overpower him. Instead, I think what happened was God allowed Jacob to prevail. And the reason being is because he's saying, Jacob, when you wrestle with your brother, when you wrestle with your uncle, when you wrestle with life, you cannot prevail without me. But when I'm in it, when I'm there with you, you can prevail. When you are weak, when you are struggling, when you're humble, and that's when I show you my grace. That's when I show you my power. I think Paul, the apostle, got this. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says this, "But my Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses," says Paul, "so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake," Paul says, "I delight in weaknesses. I delight in my insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul's saying that when he is weak, that's when he prevails. And I think that gets to the heart of what's going on here. When Jacob was wrestling with God, Jacob realized that when he is weak, that's when he prevails. It's only when we stop trusting ourselves, get this, people, it's only when we stop trusting ourselves, that's when we start to learn to trust in God. That's when we start to learn to trust in Christ. Only when we start to trust in Christ, that's when we prevail. Jacob emerged marked by God. He had this hip out of place. He also emerged changed person. He emerged from this wrestling a changed person. It's interesting. The man asked him, "What is your name?" The man said, "Your name is no longer Jacob." Do you know what the word Jacob means? It means literally deceiver. It means deceiver. And you know what he wrestled next to this river? You know what the name of the river, Jacob? You know what that means? It means wrestler. So this deceiver is by the river wrestling with God. And it says your name is no longer going to be deceiver, it's going to be Israel. Do you know what the word Israel means? It comes from two Hebrew words, one meaning, one Sarah and the other El. Literally it means one who prevails victoriously with God. Isn't that a great name? One who prevails victoriously with God. The significance of Jacob's name was ownership. It was God saying, "You belong to me." You see, God changed Abram's name to Abraham, Sarai's name to Sarah, Simon to Peter, Saul to Paul. Because basically, each one of them said, "Yes, Lord, I believe in you, I trust you." And when they trusted him, he changed their name. Because they were a changed person. Because they knew Christ. It's interesting, in Acts chapter 4, I love the passage where Peter and John are dragged before the Sanhedrin for healing this blind man. And they're dragged before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin looks at them and says this. They saw the courage, it says, of Peter and John, and they realized that these were unschooled, ordinary men. They were astonished to look at them. Why were they astonished? Well, they were ordinary. They were unschooled. And yet they had this great courage. And then the text says something I absolutely love. It says this. They took note that these men had been with Jesus. You see, Jesus had changed their life. When Jesus steps into our life becomes an open book. We open up a new chapter to our life. You know, if you go to southern Italy, they celebrate New Year's in a very unique way. At midnight, just as it's approaching, the streets are almost empty. People take all the cars off the streets. They pretty much empty the streets. It's really eerily quiet. I saw a video of it this past week. It's very, very quiet. Even the police officers take cover. Because at midnight, just as the clock is striking 12 in Italy, particularly in the southern part, the shutters of the windows open up, the doors open up, and what do? They take all the stuff they don't want anymore, and they throw it outside. I saw a video of someone throwing an appliance outside. Why? Because the old is no longer needed. The old way is no longer needed. So they out with the old, in with the new type of thing. And then they set off fireworks and music, and all this stuff is being chucked out the window. I love it. I think that's a great way to celebrate. I'm going to try to convince Linda of that. We're just going to chuck all the stuff that we don't want anymore out the window. That's exactly, when we are with Christ, that's exactly what happens in our life. All the old stuff is gone. What did Paul say? If anyone's in Christ, they're a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. I remember when I was growing up, I wanted to be a tennis player really bad. I thought I was God's gift to tennis. I really wanted to be a tennis player. So I played and played and played and practiced and practiced and practiced. Finally, I think it was my dad pulled me aside and said, son, I really love you. And out of love, I'm going to tell you something. You're not good at tennis. My dad is a child psychologist. I mean, can you imagine telling your child that they're not good at something? But actually, it was the best news. Because then I realized I needed to do something else. God gave me this beautiful gift of mathematics. He gave me this gift ability to do math. So I went to college to be a math teacher. I took education classes so I could be a teacher because I love teaching. And as I went through college, I got to my senior year, and Linda and I thought I was going to be a math teacher in Holland, Michigan, and we were picking out houses and all that kind of stuff. We were ready to go. And all of a sudden, God pulled away my love for math and said, no, you don't like math anymore. And I didn't. I loved my education classes. And God had replaced my love for math with a love for theology. And I thought, for sure, I must be a professor. I'm going to be a theology professor. I'm going to teach theology. So I went away and got a PhD in theology. And while I was almost finished with that, a little Baptist church in Pittenweem, Scotland called me and said, would you come and preach for us every Sunday? And all of a sudden, my love for being a professor went away. And I realized that I love being a church pastor. That's what I love doing. And it's funny. I look at those stages in my life, and each stage I was wrestling with God, and I was wrestling and wrestling and wrestling. And I'm like, no, God, this is exactly what I want to do. This is exactly what I should be doing. And God has a funny way of pulling me aside and saying, no, this is what I want you to do. When we trust, we will believe in God, God's power becomes our power, and He gives us the courage to make those changes. He changes our life. All we need to do is just cling to Him. Remember that in the story, it says that Jacob just clung to this man, clung to this angelic messenger. Why? You could read it as he was clinging him to overpower him, but I don't think so. I think the prophet Hosea has it right. In Hosea chapter 12, verse 4, it says, he struggled with the angel and overcame him, but then it says he wept and begged for his favor. In other words, I think Jacob is clinging to him. not out of a sense of, I want my way with you, but he's clinging with him out of a sense of desperation. I need to be blessed by you. I've got my father-in-law pursuing me. I've got my brother pursuing me. I've got all these issues in my life. I've got all these struggles in my life. I sent my wife and my kids over to meet Esau so that maybe he might take pity on me. I've got a lot of these issues. I don't think this is a demand. I think it's a tearful plea. No longer does Jacob seek to gain the advantage through trickery or deceit. I think for the very first time, Jacob is being truly honest here. And he begs for God's blessing. The third thing is, we cannot wrestle with God without coming away marked. We are marked when we wrestle with God. God changes our life. And I think the third thing is we emerge blessed. And that's the good news here. We emerged blessed. When we struggle, we emerged blessed. It's interesting, yesterday when I went hiking to the top of Camelback with Denise and Don Moore. And it was interesting. On the way down, it was a struggle to get up. And on the way down, we're passing all these people who are trying to convince themselves that they can do this. Or they're trying to convince others that they can do it. There was one mom who was talking with her little girl. Little girl like this big. And little mom's like, come on, you can do this. We're halfway there. And she looks over at me, and I'm like, she looks back at a little girl, and she says, okay, we're a quarter way there. And I'm like, I didn't say a word. This little girl was struggling. She didn't want to take another step. I passed another group of people. They were all bridesmaids, and there was a bride. In fact, there was a couple of groups out there like that. I didn't see any grooms or groomsmen, but I did see some brides and bridesmaids. Actually, I saw 3 groups. I think it was 3 or 4. Anyways, it's funny. One woman was complaining as she's walking with the rest of the bridesmaids. She's complaining. She says, "How much further is this?" And we're hiking all the way up there. And again, they're about the quarter mark. We're hiking all the way up there. And then she says, "What are we going to do when we get to the top? How are we getting down?" And without missing a beat, I was amazed. The bride turned, and with a straight face, she says, "Well, of course, you know there's an elevator up there, and it's going to take us back down." And the girl went, "Oh, okay, good." And off they went. And I sat there, and I went, "Ay, ay, ay." Yes, I was curious. Jacob wasn't wrestling anymore. I think he was just struggling to hold on here. Jacob found out that you do not get anywhere with God by struggling and resisting. The only way that you get anywhere with God is by yielding and just holding on. My friends, you may be struggling this morning with something. You may be struggling with someone in your life, a coworker. You may be struggling with God right now. And just say, "God, I don't know. I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure what you need me to do next, or what you want me to do about this, and you're tired of fighting." And I tell you this morning, I'll give you one word of advice. Just cling. Just cling to Christ. Just cling to Christ. What was the significance of Jacob's new name? Israel. I put this at the end of my notes. I said, my friends, do you need God to rename you this morning? Do you need God to rename you? Maybe you're just tired of being deceiver, liar. You know what Jacob's literal name means? It means someone who grabs. Maybe you're tired of just constantly grabbing all the time at straws. Maybe this morning God needs to rename you follower. Jesus needs to rename you disciple. God needs to rename you Christian. All you need to do is say, yes, Lord, I'm clinging to you for the rest of my life. Let's pray. Gracious God,